So I'm drawing on, I just updated this because I've done a lot recently. I've done about 15, probably more actually, as an external examiner at older universities, new universities, a few overseas universities. I've been through 10 vivas as a supervisor, which is by far the worst experience because you feel so accountable but you've very little power within the viva. So we'll talk about that later on. And about 10 as an internal examiner. I'm a social scientist, so it's just about all being within the social sciences. So there may be a sort of social welfare bias in what I'm saying, but I think most of it is transferable across disciplines. So these are recent experiences that have literally happened. In fact, I have 3 on the run, but these were 3 consecutive ones. A student of mine had a new mobile, and it kept going off, and it was so new she didn't know how to switch it off. So it was just basic, if you like, health and safety precautions like that. I couldn't believe this. This is one of the worst things that's ever happened to me professionally. Most universities have an independent chair. We have an independent chair, some don't. And their job is fairly straightforward. They introduce the process, they keep it on track, and they don't contribute academically. And this guy literally fell asleep in the middle of the viva, which was very, well, obviously rude. But you'll find when you get near your viva that people compare it to things like a driving test, that it's very nerve-wracking and you very much feel unsure. And it was very unnerving for this candidate to see the chairperson falling asleep. And for the one and only time in my career, actually, as soon as I got back here, I emailed the Vice-Chancellor and said, this is unprofessional and we need to do something. And luckily, the candidate was very good. If he'd been poorer and had failed or whatever, he could have appealed and he would have won an appeal, I think. So, and the one I haven't put up there, you won't believe this one. Quite a local university, turned up say at 10 o'clock, overseas student. The supervisor was meant to join us at 10 o'clock, and she didn't join us. One of the secretaries came in and whispered in the internal's ear, which at the time I thought, oh well, that's really rude. And be prepared for a shock. The supervisor had fallen downstairs and died that morning. That is an absolutely true story. So the lesson of that is that anything can happen. Be prepared. They're obviously all extreme in different ways, but be prepared. I mean, very easy, very simple things. I've got this on the next slide. One very, very basic thing, and without wishing to insult the intelligence, get there in good time. Because you know that fluster feeling where you're a bit late, and often in these big buildings, you might know where the Rose Bowl is, but finding 313 is a whole different thing. So just be as calm and cool and prepared as you can be. Think about the viva will be time to suit your external. So if they're travelling, it depends if they stay overnight, in which case it'll probably be a 10 o'clock start. If they're travelling, it may be a 2 o'clock start. But you can steer that to a degree. So if you're the sort of person who would like to get up and get on with it, then say, I'd like to be at 10 if possible. If you're the sort of person who would like to do that last minute preparation, which actually I don't particularly recommend, I'll tell you why in a minute, then I have to say, well, I prefer it at 2. You can't decide, but you can influence it. So be prepared for the unexpected. I have put it, yeah. So arrive in good time, cool and calm. Bring a copy of your thesis with you, although I'm going to give you a word of warning in a minute about that. And just a technical thing, make sure it's correctly paginated, because if you print it out on your home computer and the layout's a bit different and all your page numbers are different, and that would really fluster you then if the examiner says on page 102 you make this point and on your copy it's page 87. So just silly things that do go wrong that would so make sure your copy is identical to the copy that the internals and the externals have. I would mark it up with post-its, just at key points, not hundreds, but perhaps however it works in yours, perhaps the chapter pages, and then put them down the side of the thesis, so you can, if they say it in chapter 2, then you can quickly find chapter 2. The thing I find, I've got a little bit on body language and things later on, the thing I find that people often do that doesn't look good is that they look down at the thesis and they're constantly leafing through it like that, and it doesn't give a good impression to the examiners. So I would be quite confident about your knowledge of your thesis. You'll know more about it than the examiners, and you know if they say you quote Gramsci on page 53, well, you know that. You don't really have to check it and look it up. So I will be quite confident that you know your work. And unless this page says specifically, I've got a query about your diagram on page 82, why is it 5 columns, shouldn't it be 6? Then I wouldn't go through it. It disrupts the flow, and it's not effective. I would just have a summary top sheet, almost like perhaps an annotated contents list, so you know when they're saying chapter 3, because it's similar to job interviews, where you can blank out very quickly. In the job interview I had before here, they asked me what I would bring to the job, and I'd forgotten to bring a copy of the letter of application, and they actually said, well, I made it clear in my letter of application because I sort of totally blanked on what I had put in there. So it will just help you to have that summary. You will be, I think it's one of the most nerve-wracking experiences. This isn't going to help you in a way, but it is a very, very nerve-wracking experience, comparable to, I think probably a driving test is a good comparison, where you put in lots of preparation and where one error could be quite costly. So, and if you remember, I remember being really nervous for my driving test. So you will be very, very nervous. If you think about it, it's very self-exposing, isn't it? You're saying, this is the product of my labour for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, and you're asking for critical feedback, or you're going to get critical feedback on it. So I think, can you relate to this? I think people find it very personally self-exposing, that you are being explored as an individual and being tested, and it's something that you're very emotionally. That's why I was so upset about that guy falling asleep. But it's a big emotional investment by the candidate, and it should be respected by the panel. So be prepared. I wouldn't do the sort of school revision on the bus on the way to the exam, because you do know, and I think that will muddle your head really. You don't need to be reading it the night before. In fact, I would recommend the night before that you quite relax. I actually wouldn't read it the night before. I'd go and see a junk movie or watch Coronation Street. Have an early night, be nice and relaxed. It's better than being all, your mind being overactive. Hi. Hi, welcome. Can you just tell us quickly your name and your topic and when you're by there, maybe?
My name is Bilal Asawai. I'm doing DBA. I don't know when it will be, but sometime this year.
Right, okay, well, we're all just flat on the same page with that. So we've just started saying that preparation is absolutely crucial. Writing good time, copy of your thesis, which is identical to one that the external and the internal has. Mark it up lightly, not heavily, with post-its, and perhaps just have a top sheet. One thing that the top sheet helps you do is I would make a note of any key points that you wish to make, and often the final question will be, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't explored? So, if you've got 5 or 6 key points that you want to get across, you may want to add those. So the actual process at this university is that there is an independent chair. So they can be for anywhere in the university, and they may not be familiar with your discipline. They will have a copy of your thesis, but they probably won't read it. I think when I'm independent chair, I familiarise myself so I know the topic, but there's no expectation or duty to read it. There'll be an internal examiner who will be someone that your supervisor knows, who will have read it in detail and has, in theory, joint status with the external, but I think the external has more power. I'll explain that in a minute. So there'll be an internal examiner, say Bill's one of my students, I'm in the social work team, probably wouldn't have anyone in the social work team because that's too close to me, so I'd probably ask someone in youth work, for example, or in psychology, or in education perhaps in Bill's case. So someone that's related to the discipline, but who probably won't map on exactly. The powerful figure for me is the external examiner. And the people know who the external is. Well, if you haven't chosen them yet, the key variable at any viva is the external examiner. So I think if your supervisor knows them, they're not allowed to know them well. They can't be like the next door neighbour or the friend. But probably the sort of people you'd meet at conferences or you would have heard keynotes. And this is like an academic point, but I do think personality matters. So I've met externals and I tried to take this approach, if you like, that are empathetic, who are thinking, this person's put 5 years of their life into this, it's basically really good, I've obviously got a few challenges, but I'm sympathetic and empathetic with them. And I've met, well, I'll give you 2 examples. These were from my students. I had a student who wrote a big qualitative social science piece, and there was a 3-page statistical appendix just about how the survey had been undertaken and the returns. And the external focused exclusively, almost exclusively, on the quantitative, on the statistical element, and really hammered the student on something that was pretty marginal to. So I would say that's an unempathetic, unsympathetic external. And I had one in the last few weeks where someone, for me, one of my candidates, had written a very rich narrative about people's lives, a particular group of people. And it was full of rich detail about the fast food habits and the TV habits. And she had a policy head on, and she kept saying, what's policy implications? And has virtually asked him to rewrite 2 or 3 chapters with the policy head. Personally, I wouldn't have done that. I would have said this is a rich narrative thesis. So it's really the lesson is to choose your external with care, and your supervisor will know of them. So we'll know of them at least. We're not allowed to know them intimately. So choose your external with care. Fairly obvious, a good way as any of picking your external is to go through your bibliography. And someone that you've referenced a lot, hopefully someone you haven't critiqued too much, but externals will be accepting of some critique. But if you find, I've used 5 or 6 articles by Bert Smith, then why not use him as an external? It means he knows your subject. And we're all human. The first thing I do with any PhD is look in the back and see if I'm referenced in it. So, any external will do that. So they'd be well disclosed, as long as you utilise their work well. So think about that. We're not allowed to use overseas externals, so you need someone in the UK basically. They won't pay expenses for people to fly from Canada or Australia. And I think you can arrange for Skype, but I wouldn't recommend that. You lose the human interaction, the eye contact, the chance to have a little bit of a joke or whatever over Skype. Personally, I would probably do that. So look for a UK external that you've referenced, that your supervisor or someone in your peer group knows, and that is basically a decent human being, that isn't going to be unreasonable or good. The trouble with externals is they often go down their own narrow little alleyway that's their career, and they expect you to agree that that's the most important element of any study. And personally, I will try not to do that. So the room will be set out. The examiners will have been there for about an hour before. and they will plan the questions. Let me just check the next slide. Right, yeah. They will plan the questions, the internal and the external, and the steer from the independent chair. The reason I asked if you're a member of staff, you have 2 external examiners, so that's the difference. There's 2 questions I will prepare for. One is, what's your original contribution to knowledge? There'll be some variation about what the strengths of your thesis, what's the originality of your thesis. The strict criteria is what's your original contribution to knowledge. So I would actually practice that in the mirror or with a partner. That's just about the only question you can guarantee. So I would, literally practice that. The other question you generally be asked is the one I mentioned before. At the end, is there anything you would like to add that we haven't covered? So if you feel, sorry to pick on you, but if Gramsci hadn't been mentioned in the whole thesis, then you might want to say, well, I have used Gramsci extensively, I've been very influenced by his work and I feel it's fundamental to my thesis and I hope that's come through in the writing. So, so you get a chance to show the strengths of your thesis. I run mock vivas, and generally, say I ask 10 questions in a mock viva, probably one of them will come up in the real viva. So it's worth doing a mock viva, but you'd be very, very lucky if the same questions come up. But you can practice all the things that we're mentioning here. Sorry, I can't remember the order of the new slides. Oh yeah, we'll do that now. So it gives you a chance to practice and rehearse, and just practicing and rehearsing. First time, I'm guessing you've all done conference papers now. First time you were probably very, very nervous. Second time less nervous. Third, fourth, fifth time. So it's just like any practicing. It will make you more confident, but I wouldn't think, it would normally be with your supervisors, but I wouldn't think, oh, they're the questions that will come up in the Viva, you just cannot predict that. But prepare the original contribution and anything you would like to add. Question I often ask, and it probably is worth preparing for, is there anything you would do differently in retrospect? So, maybe your sampling went a bit awry, you had problems getting into a school, or, so I perhaps have something where you say, well, what I've learned is that my sample was a little bit small, I was over ambitious, or whatever. So I would prepare something like that. Now, this is the human art. This is the key point of the whole session. And it's about being socially sensitive, all these words that are around at the moment, like mindfulness and being emotionally resilient and all that sort of thing. How do you defend your thesis without seeming arrogant? And it's a real tightrope to walk. You want to be proud of your work. It's a good piece of work. It wouldn't be submitted if it wasn't. You should be really proud of it. It's your product. You've committed to it. You chose the topic originally. You should be really proud of your work, and I wouldn't be ashamed to be proud of your work. So I've made an original contribution. I'll pick Williams because I know that best of all. I've observed the interaction between early years workers and lead professionals and teachers. I've been in the room with them. I know what goes on in the rooms. I know how they engage parents and sometimes children and young people because I've seen it with my own eyes and I've analysed it. No one's ever done it quite in this way before, and therefore I'm making an original. So it's a bit like selling yourself at a job interview. You wouldn't go into a job interview and say, oh, I'm really lacking the skills for this job and I'm not very experienced. You've got to be confident and sell your work. But then this is the tightrope. You've got to accept criticism as well. So it will be very specific to you. But it's okay to say, well, that's a really good point you've just made. That's a challenge that I will take on board in my future work. Or I did consider that, and the reason I didn't do it was this. So you need to be I'm almost asking you to be an impossible. You need to be arrogant and humble at the same time, and you need to find that balance between the two. So I wouldn't feel. One thing about PhDs is uncertainty. So do you remember when you did your first school exams, there was a right answer? Well, in a PhD there isn't a right answer. So if everything's uncertain, then it's okay to be uncertain. To say, well, that's a really good point that I'd like to reflect on further, because there isn't a right answer as such. So that uncertainty makes it really open to appropriate challenge. So, as I say, almost impossible, be arrogant and humble simultaneously. I would say that's the key art. I'll give you an example of a PhD which I thought was problematic. This was the week before Christmas. And the defence was brilliant. So I'll give you an example of the challenge. He used dictionary definitions of sociological words. And I wouldn't do that in a PhD, because in sociology every word is, the trendy word is contested. So in a dictionary there'll be a definition of the word class, social class. But in sociology, some people would say, well, that's outdated, that's that's an industrial concept, and they were post-industrial. It's contested. So personally, I would never use a dictionary definition. So I challenged this candidate and said, I'm really surprised you're using Oxford Dictionary definitions at PhD level. Isn't the point of the PhD that these definitions are to be challenged and are open and are fluid and flexible? And he was quite verging on the aggressive, but did a brilliant defence. He said, I think you'll find, if you read it carefully, I used a dictionary definition as the universal utilisation of this word, then I deconstructed it and I challenged the definition. And when I looked at it, that was what he was doing. So that was a brilliant defence. So I actually went into that thinking, this is something like a major rewrite. And it came out as a pretty technical minor rewrite. So he actually robustly defended his thesis. That's the best example I've ever seen. So try and get that balance if you can. So the confidence bit is be confident that you know your thesis more, you know it better than anyone else. The internal and the external, particularly the external, will be. Oh dear, there's a typo there. That's bad. The internal and external will have read it, but you'll know it better than they do. So you know more about your data and your topic than anyone else. Also, demonstrate that confidence. Make sure you demonstrate your achievements. So what's the sample, if it is relevant, what's your use of theory, what's your contribution to knowledge. So it's very similar to a job interview, and you all will have done this, and I've done this, where you come out of the job interview and you think, why didn't I mention that I've done this? So it's very similar to that. So on your checklist at the front, have the key points. I want to mention how large my sample was, how I used a good range of theories or whatever the relevance is, and your contribution to knowledge. And then be confident enough to recognise your shortfalls, the typo, things that you could have done different. So I would verbalise that in some particular way that I was intending to interview 20 young people, but unfortunately 4 or 5 didn't turn up on the day. I did try and contact them again, but it was just impossible, so I've ended up with a sample of 16. So all researchers know that's real world research. No research project goes smoothly, goes to time, everything falls into place, that never ever happens. I've got 1 out of 20 projects where that more or less happened, but the other 19 or whatever, things went wrong. So a good internal external will know that. They don't expect you to have a plan described in your methodology that was perfectly executed. So be confident enough to say, oh, that was a little bit of a mistake, or you know, whatever the particular problem was. So, sorry, these are the things I've asked. So the things you could prepare: what's your original contribution to knowledge? What would you do differently in retrospect? And depending on your work, it probably doesn't apply to yours, it does apply to William's. You'll probably be asked what are the implications for policy and practice. So I will think that through in some detail. So points I've made. The external is the key player, and choose carefully. They may sometimes focus on a particular point or issue. So if they do that and you're confident in your territory, then just go with it. If it's territory you don't want to be on, then do the politician thing. You know, answer the question that you wish they'd asked. So you can get away with it to a degree. Just a little bit about the process at the beginning. So I've examined about 30, perhaps getting on for 40 now. On 2 occasions, they've been absolutely brilliant, and I've said at the beginning, we're minded to pass this thesis, and we want to have an in-depth discussion of the issues. So if they say that, it's obviously good news. But generally, it is actually against protocol to say that. But there were 2 cases where I thought it was perfectly obvious, and I wasn't going to play the game of saying, you know, I was worried about the sampling or I was concerned about the use of theory. So there's just a chance that they would say that. Probably the timetabling at this university allows an hour and a half to 2 hours for the viva. I try and curtail discussion about 1 hour 15 because I just think it's very tiring and a little bit losing purpose by the time you've got a sort of hour mark. If you have a short viva, it could be good news or bad news. If you have a short one, they might be thinking, oh, this is so good, let's go through the process and then we'll just tell them how wonderful it is at the end. Or they might be thinking, this is so appalling, I'm not spending an hour and a half discussing this rubbish, and therefore we'll keep. So you'll know probably which one of those it is. You'll be able to judge. Your supervisor is in the room. Sorry, I didn't say this before. Normally, your supervisor's in the room, and their job is to take notes. They're not allowed to contribute. So it takes some burden off you. But you'll know if the external asks you 3 questions about chapter structure, then you can second guess that one of the requirements at the end is going to be to restructure your chapter. So you'll be able to pick up if there's a passing question and they nod and smile and move on, that may not be an issue. If you're starting to get 2 or 3 questions on a particular issue, then you more or less know that's where they're going to go. The nerve-wracking bit is when you go out of the room at the end. I'll take you through that at the end. So just a little bit about body language, and you can role play this with your supervisor or with a friend or a partner if they're in a similar business to you, and I would role play it. Just how important body language is, and it may just start observing people's body language. So the obvious ones, this says I'm nervous and apprehensive, this says I'm probably a bit cocky and overconfident, so think about it. I would have eye contact with you as soon as you start talking about eye contact, you get very self-aware of it. I would have eye contact with your examiners, with the internal and the external, so look at the one that's asked you the question. Obviously speak clearly, project. It's like people are willy-nilly giving evidence in court. It's not unlike that, where you know, it's not a conversation in a pub. You are on show and you are projecting. So you do want to get your points across with some confidence. Eye contact with the questioner. Listen, slightly contradicting what I've said before, but listen carefully to the actual question. What is the thing that they are asking you about? Because you will in your head have your pet answers, but they may ask you a slightly different question.
Are you,
go on.
sorry, are you able to sort of raise things yourself sometimes? You know, so if you think that a question needs sort of refocus, or there's an area which you want to talk about, sort of structure, you know, if say for instance you let's focus on school contribution and the barriers to a certain subject, but the exam is sort of going in a different direction. Can you sort of guide it?
Yeah, you can steer it. You can steer it. So I'll take a risk with Dave's field, which I know very little about, but say question about Johnny Cash as some sort of working class hero, and you really want to talk about Woody Guthrie. So I would say, well, Johnny Cash is, I'm talking making this up. Johnny Cash is a really good example of someone representing the working class, grassroots folk music in the States. But actually, a better example is Woody Guthrie, because you know more about Woody Guthrie, and that's what you want to suspect. That makes sense.
I probably argue the other way.
Right. But so that sort of steer. I mean, not to totally contradict them, but to steer it in a particular direction. Now, there's a balance here about the length of your questions, the length of your answers. So a PhD viva is never a yes/no answer, you know, unless they say, "Did you submit on time?" or something. Yes, I did. Apart from that, so you're going to give a discursive answer. I wouldn't actually let your answer go on and on and on. Probably 3, 4. If you try at home to talk for 3 or 4 minutes, it's a lot of words actually, 3 or 4 minutes. So I would, depending on the question obviously, I wouldn't go on for more than 7, 8 minutes. I think you'll lose the attention of your examiner. And you should be able to summarise your key points within 4, 5, 6, perhaps 7 or 8 minutes. I wouldn't go on and on and on. And I have sometimes lost focus because a candidate's drifted on for hours. And your examiner's probably got 12, perhaps up to 18, 20 questions. So if you monopolise one, then they're either going to drop questions or it's going to go on and everyone's going to get tired and touchy. Mobile phone off the talk and marking up your thesis.
What does that say? I think about the field defense to your thesis. First thing to do is disarming the question. Because the people who was asking, disarming them. What they mean by that is like telling them what I know, or just guide them to ask me about the things I know.
Well, I don't know exactly. Disarming the question. Yeah, I think it's what I've been saying really. That if they say, do you feel that your sample was a little bit small? Say your sample was 8 people, then you disarm them by saying, well, I feel it's a sample of 8 is more than adequate because it's an in-depth, detailed study. So you take them on, you try and take the power out of the question. So it's about being confident, really. So I think we've done all this. So I will go for succinct and appropriately academic. So don't ramble on for 10, 15 minutes. It's not helpful to anyone. Probably not helpful to you because you will lose your focus. So you should be able to think, right, there's 2 or 3 key points I want to get over. I can do it quite succinctly and quite quickly. And as we said, have a few points that you want to make. And at the end, if there's anything you want to add, like me. No. At the end, they'll probably ask you if you've got anything to add. Don't say yes for the sake of it. Just say if it's been a really good viva, then say no, I feel that we've covered all the main points and there's nothing I want to add. If you do want to add, keep it brief, because when they ask that question, that really means, right, we know what we're thinking and we're ready to close down the viva, so don't go into a 20-minute answer at the end. So the outcome, sorry I don't know why I'm putting them on the slide here, but it's in your university guidance. So I've examined 40. There's been 2 cases where they've just gone through, they've been fine. The vast majority are minor amendments. So in your head and to your friends and partners, I would say, well, I'm expecting to have another 2 or 3 weeks work to doing it. Typos are the most remarkable thing. I've had a few on this PowerPoint. I've used this PowerPoint before, it's still got typos on it. And quite often candidates come in and the first thing they say is, I've spotted some typos, I'm really sorry. It's something about, I think computer screens are very unhelpful for spotting typos, and we're over-reliant on word checks. So if you put shower instead of show, it won't come over on the word check, it will say shower on the page where you didn't mean shower, you meant show. And you will find them on your hard copy. I expect to find 20 or 30. If I get up to more than that, I'm beginning to think this is carelessness. But nearly everyone has a number of typos. So in your head, I would expect minor amendments. I wouldn't expect to just walk away with a. If that happens, it's brilliant, but it's best to. I would schedule in after your viva, perhaps 2 weeks to do your minor amendments. The timescale I think is 3 months, but I wouldn't spend 3 months doing it. Generally, minor amendments, if you've got all day, if you're not working that particular day, I'd try and diary, as soon as you know your viva, put perhaps 4 or 5 days in your diary soon after, where you can do the minor amendments. The next one is major amendments, where there's things that aren't explored. Probably we're up to perhaps 30 or 40%, if they're probably just a minority get minor, but a good lot get major. I wouldn't be downhearted at all by that. You've been through a very rigorous process. Often, as I say, an external will have an agenda. Remember, this will sit on a library shelf for the rest of humanity's time on Earth. So you want it to be perfect. So I wouldn't feel too upset if the external, the internal say, and often I've said this, really your introduction doesn't pay due tribute to your work. Your work's much stronger and you don't sell it in your introduction. Or often it's the conclusion that really lets you down. You've got some really good data and you haven't followed it through in your conclusion. So there's a grey line between minor and major, but you're probably into major then. I wouldn't be too disappointed about that at all. I think that's a couple of days' work. Where it gets more like hard work is if they want you to restructure your chapters, and then that throws your pagination in your chapter structure, because then you have to go through the whole thing where you say, because chapter 10's become chapter 11 and page 52's become page 62. So at that stage it becomes hard work. But in my experience, examiners try not to give you that for that very reason. So they'll often focus on your abstract, your introduction and your conclusion, because it's quite easily doable and it doesn't throw the whole structure. There's also something about data chapters that are a bit more straightforward depending on exactly what you do. But St. William's example, probably his chapters 3 and 4 are going to be crudely, the teacher said this, the parents said that, the early years worker said this. So there isn't that much for the examiners to challenge really. It would tend to be in the more analytical, perhaps the discussion chapter, the conclusion where their challenge would come through. So it would tend to be at that end. I've external to appalling, absolutely appalling PhDs. It wouldn't, I'm fairly confident it wouldn't happen at this university, and you might think that the progress meeting Did it go well?
It did
Good.
actually, yeah. Thanks.
Which
Well, yeah.
we didn't have today, unfortunately. I couldn't be there because I was injuries free. You might think it's a pain in the neck, but actually that's the university's quality assurance process. So I externaled a PhD last summer, a year ago now, and it wouldn't have been submitted at this university. It was appalling. It was appallingly written, and something had gone majorly. So it was similar to Williams actually, the topic area, and in the original area, in the original intention, it was to interview 32 young people, and she interviewed 2 young people, and it just meant the whole thesis fell. And because of the progress meetings here, they will have asked you how many of these meetings have been. So it literally couldn't happen, as long as you're honest at your progress meeting. It couldn't have happened here. So I know progress meetings can be a pain, particularly if you're travelling, but they do give that quality assurance. So that example of a plot, it was appallingly written. It was, she just totally failed on this sample from 36, I think it was, to 2. And there were alternative strategies. She was trying to talk to specific young people, but we did come up with a strategy where she could have approached a school and spoken to a whole class about the issue, and then perhaps 20 people in a class, and it would have been more of a focus group than a one-to-one, but she hadn't done anything like that. It was littered in typos, like 5 or 6 on every single page. So the other external happened to be a friend of mine, and luckily we totally agreed, and the candidate actually got very angry with us, but it was good that we knew each other and we were able to sort of support each other through that. So that should just not happen to you. So if something major goes wrong with your big idea or your sample or your interviews, you most likely supervisor that and discuss it at the progress meeting. The other one was it's one of the worst things I've ever done in my academic career. The candidate had flown over from Jamaica, and the work was just appalling. This is at a very famous red brick university. The work was appalling. She'd actually done it was about children in care. There's 60,000 children in care in England and Wales, and she'd done a formula. And the first line of the thesis was there's over 1 million children in care in England and Wales. So that means that every sort of 5th family you met would have children in care if that was true. That was actually the first line of the thesis, and we failed it. And she actually said my job in Jamaica was dependent on passing this thesis. It was absolutely excruciating. So, but none of you were going to be in that final transcript. So my point is, if you're very, very, very meticulous and an element of luck, perhaps 2%, 5% go through without anything, I would fully expect minor amendments, perhaps 3 or 4. I always do a sheet of typos. I'm often up to 3 sheets of typos even on the PhDs. There's something. Actually, to be honest, they may not all be typos. Some of them may be typos. Some of them. I've got a thing about in PhDs not using everyday expressions like at the end of the day or something like that. So it's not a typo, but I would pick it up and say find a more academic expression than at the end of the day, or it's all down to, or something like that. So I've got up to 3 or 4 pages, even on quite good ones. And I expect them to say strengthen your introduction, strengthen your conclusion, have a discussion on this. And I wouldn't be disappointed then at all, I wouldn't. That means in, say, 6 weeks, you resubmit. It's a bit of a pain because of all the printing and everything. But you resubmit, it would, if it's minor, it just goes to the internal. The internal would just check that you've treated it with due respect, and then you would pass. So really a minor amendment is like a pass. Major amendment may be longer, well it will be longer, and it may be quite difficult, particularly to say if it's shifting your structure, your pagination, your chapter structure. But again, I wouldn't be disappointed. It's probably 3 or 4 months work, say 2 or 3 days a week, and then you will pass. So, in summary, if I go through the stage, first stage, if you haven't got your exam team, really spend some time with your supervisors thinking about your external. It's absolutely, if I said there was one variable, it's the external. Because I've seen externals that have been very empathetic, brilliant. I've seen externals that I think have been virtually inhumane. But the work, it doesn't say anything about the quality of the work, it's about the quality of the examiner. So I've really put effort into that. On the day of Viva, be prepared, more personally prepared, be showered, be rested, have a good sleep. I wouldn't worry about reading your thesis on the night before. You know your thesis. I really wouldn't do that. I think it clutters your brain with too much detail. Take your thesis with you, paginated in the same way as the one you submitted. Have a crib sheet on a summary and perhaps 5 or 6 key points you want to make. Listen to the questions. Don't speak for too long about any given question. The thing you need to practice in your mock Viva is this thing about humility and arrogance. It's a very difficult, I can't say any better than that. It sounds almost impossible, but get some balance of being self-confident and proud, and some balance of being accepting of criticism and humble. That's what PhDs are about: complexity, fluidity, challenge, etc., etc. Then prepare for the results. Expect minor amendments and celebrate if you do. Don't be too downhearted if you get major. Lots of people do, and it's just a matter of playing the game, really. And then at the end, good luck. So, any questions, discussions?
You know, the external examiner, do you select that? Can you influence that?
Yeah. It's up to the. Yeah, I should have explained that process. There's a for some reason the form is appalling. It's an online form that's very hard to edit. So, my job as your supervisor is to find a chairperson, which really is not a big issue. It's a technical job, as long as they don't fall asleep. It doesn't worry me who the chairperson is. An internal examiner, I would try and get the right one. So I would know the internal, probably in passing. And then the external we've discussed too, if you remember, of staff. So the process is that I would write to the external and say, I wouldn't mention your name, I'd say I've got a candidate who's near completion, we expect to Viva during 2015. Perhaps just mention he does draw on your work in his thesis, and therefore we wondered if you would be willing to act as external. Generally people say yes, unless they're going to have a year's working in Australia or whatever. Generally people would say yes. That form then goes to quite a rigorous committee, the Exam Arrangements Committee, which is chaired by Andrew Slade, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and he does bounce them back. So sometimes there's a really good external who may not have externaled a PhD before, so you have to make a case and get a very experienced internal. So if your external is someone you've really utilised, then but isn't very experienced, then make sure you get a very experienced internal, and then your supervisor will make that case. The internal examiners examined 15 PhDs before, and even though this is the externals first, this will be balanced off. But that, I have had exam teams bounced back by Andrew Slade. He's quite strict about getting that balance of experience and expertise.
Just to point on the procedure, once you've had your Viva, and whether you get minor amendments or major amendments, you then resubmit it, whether in a few weeks or a few months, depending which, and then the external and the internal look at it again. And what do they actually do then?
Yeah, if it's minor, sorry, it's just the internal as a rule.
Right.
If it's major, it tends to be the external. They would want a covering letter from you. Sorry, I didn't explain this bit. You will get reports at the end of the Viva, and it will say, perform well in the Viva, the examiners thought the thesis is very strong and you perform well in the Viva, however there are 4 points that we'd like you to address. And then, so you will put a covering letter with your next submission saying the examiners asked me to cover 4 points, I've changed the chapter heading to chapter 3. I've added some analysis in the discussion. I've amended the bibliography where I've forgotten to put in 5 so they don't want to read your thesis again. They just want to check that you've done the 3, 4, 5 prints.
So it's all in writing.
Yeah. So you signposted it for them.
So no need for the committee to come back again?
No. In the one I've just talked about that was appalling, we are having a second Bible, but that's never happened before. So, generally it's the internal for minor, perhaps the external for major. And I've never known, as long as you've addressed it in goodwill, then that's the end of the process. I've never known an internal to say, oh, there's still a type on page 32, that would just be overlooked. The other thing I meant to talk about and it's the next stage, and you'll discuss this with your supervisor, is publication. So your PhDs are publishable, by definition they're publishable. So whether, I am still amazed, I get emails from publishers regularly. I've had one today, could they meet me next week? They are desperate for books, and personally I don't understand it because I don't see students wandering around with piles of books anymore, and for the obvious reason of the internet. But publishers are still keen to publish. So in my field, they're queuing up to publish books. My field's child protection mainly. They're queuing up to publish books, and I've said to them, how does this work for you? And actually what they say is that if we sell a hardback copy or 2 to every library and 1,000 paperbacks, then we're covering all the costs. So it's not a high threshold. So think about publishing your whole PhD, not as it is, you'll have to edit it to make it more accessible. There's something about just when you're an author and not a student, there's just it's hard to pin down, there's a different ambiance to your reading. You can write with more self-confidence, really. Probably as a PhD you have to say, as Smith says, as Jones says, when it's your book you can say, because I say it, there's just a more of a level of confidence there, really. So you may want to think about a book. I would say to edit a PhD to a book, if you were working on it full time, I'd take you 3 months. It's that different to a PhD. That might be too much to ask. I would, more or less, all your chapters, aside from the introduction and perhaps the methodology, could be a journal article. I would almost write them in that way, actually. So, in Williams, there could be his chapter headings, something like Parental Perspectives of the Common Assessment Framework, probably be a chapter in his thesis. That could easily be in the British Journal of Social Work next year with the same title, just tidied up a bit. So I would almost write your thesis with that in mind in a way, that it's 5 articles joined together. So I would think about that. And in the viva, they may ask you that question, have you any publication plans? Actually, I would prepare that one. And they may give you a steer when they have you in at the end. They'll often say, we really enjoyed it, we thought it was a really good piece of work and you really should consider publishing it either as a book or